Okay, let's jump straight into this explainer. Think about the world map as we know it today. It was literally forged in the fires of World War II. When we picture this massive conflict, our minds usually go straight to those raw, visceral realities of combat. You know, the grueling battles, the shattered landscapes, and cities reduced to rubble. But how did we actually get to that point? Today, we're going to break down the timeline step by step, tracing the exact sequence of events from the very first spark all the way to the devastating fall of France.
Right off the bat, we run into our core mystery. It's incredibly difficult to pinpoint just one single event that sparked the whole conflict. World War II wasn't some sudden isolated explosion that came out of nowhere. Instead, think of it more like a massive, complex setup of toppling dominoes that all conspired together to ignite a global fire.
So let's look at the spark, tracing things back from 1919 to 1933, starting with the Treaty of Versailles.
To really understand the fire, we have to examine that spark. Following the First World War, Britain and France were absolutely determined to make Germany pay a heavy price. And they did this through the War Guilt Clause, also known as Article 231. This clause explicitly forced Germany to accept complete, total responsibility for all wartime losses, completely ignoring whatever role other nations played. Basically, Germany was totally kneecapped right out of the gate. To put the sheer scale of that punishment into perspective, look at this. $270 billion. That is the modern equivalent of the fine slapped onto Germany at the time. It was a ransom so staggeringly huge that you might not even believe this, but Germany literally didn't finish paying it off until 2010. Yeah, nearly a century later. And naturally, this led to horrific economic fallout. Germany had to just start printing money to make these impossible payments, causing their currency to totally crash into hyperinflation. Get this, in 1922, a simple packet of bread cost 160 marks. Just 1 year later, that exact same bread cost 200 billion marks. The economy was entirely paralyzed. You had millions of innocent people left unemployed, homeless, and literally starving in the streets. In an environment this desperate, it becomes frighteningly easy to manipulate the masses. Enter Adolf Hitler. He used incredibly calculated, aggressive speeches to blame anti-national elements for the country's humiliation. He heavily weaponized the Judeo-Bolshevism conspiracy theory, pinning the blame for Germany's economic ruin on Jews and socialists. Following the Great Depression in 1929, when 6 million Germans were out of work, Hitler rode that wave of absolute chaos right into power, seizing dictatorial control by 1933. Moving right along to the setup phase, spanning from 1933 to 1939, focusing on appeasement and annexation.
Hitler was driven by this obsession with Lebensraum, or living space for his imagined Aryan Empire, and he aggressively started pushing boundaries. Notice how incredibly fast these dominoes fall. In 1935, he blatantly violates the Treaty of Versailles by unveiling a massive air force. Then, he starts expanding without even firing a single shot. He annexes Austria in 1938 just by installing pro-Nazi officials and rolling tanks right into Vienna without any bloodshed, heavily aided by his own toxic propaganda. Then, he sets his sights on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. The historical irony of these words from British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is just so heavy. Chamberlain was desperate to avoid another gritty, horrible war, so he actually agreed to hand over this land to Hitler during the Munich Agreement. He honestly thought this appeasement would satisfy Hitler and bring peace. Well, it completely failed. By March 1939, Hitler just marched right in and took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Now, with Czechoslovakia in his pocket, Hitler turned to Poland. But to pull this next move off, he did something completely shocking. He signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Now remember, Hitler absolutely despised communist ideology, but in this one specific, calculated moment, his interests perfectly aligned with the Soviets. They simply wanted to carve up Poland between them without having to fight each other. Which brings us to the explosion from 1939 to 1940, the Blitzkrieg unleashed. September 1939. The tension finally snaps, the diplomatic appeasements are over, and the truly raw, gritty reality of World War II begins. Nearly 1 million German troops invaded Poland, completely shocking the world with a revolutionary military strategy, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't just about throwing firepower at the enemy, it was about terrifying, unimaginable speed. By combining ultra-fast ground tanks with devastating aerial assaults from the Luftwaffe, they overwhelmed Poland so fast that the defending forces literally didn't even have time to react.
But here is something absolutely wild. The secret, dark fuel behind this relentless pace, it was chemical. German soldiers were heavily dosed with a drug called Pervitin, which we know today as crystal meth. Just imagine the sheer horror of that reality. It eliminated their need for sleep, wiped out their hunger, and numbed their pain. So while defending armies naturally had to sleep at night, these German troops fought nonstop for days, ending battles with frightening speed.
Watching this brutal expansion happen in real time, Britain and France finally lost their patience and officially declared war on Germany. But strangely, this early period is famously called the Phony War. Why? Because they essentially just stood back and watched. They sent zero actual military support to help Poland. And with their incredibly outdated army that was actually still relying on horses, Poland was absolutely crushed by the mechanized German war machine in under a week.
Meanwhile, shifting gears to the other side of the map, Stalin was getting a bit nervous. He didn't fully trust Hitler, and his major city of Leningrad was dangerously close, only 50 kilometers from the Finnish border. So Stalin preemptively invades Finland to secure some buffer space, but despite having a much smaller, far less equipped army, the fiercely tough Finnish resistance managed to hold off the massive Soviet forces in the bitter cold for over 2 brutal months before a peace treaty was finally signed.
Next up, the fall of France in 1940. Dunkirk and the Master Plan. After quickly sweeping through Norway and Denmark, Hitler pivoted his war machine westward. Neville Chamberlain resigned and Winston Churchill stepped up as prime minister right as Germany unleashed a strategic masterclass. See, France had heavily fortified its eastern border with a massive defensive wall called the Maginot Line. So what did Germany do? They just went around it. They used one group as a loud, fake distraction at the wall, sent another into the Netherlands, and sneaked their massive main force, over 40,000 vehicles, straight through the dense, supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. It was a gritty, brilliant maneuver that completely trapped the Allied armies from behind. Almost overnight, nearly 400,000 British and French soldiers were totally trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. Their backs were literally to the sea, with the relentless Nazi army closing in fast. This incredibly desperate, chaotic situation triggered Operation Dynamo. It became this legendary, massive effort where the Royal Air Force fought above, while ordinary civilians and private fishing boats braved the English Channel. Against all odds, they managed to evacuate 350,000 soldiers, though they had to leave almost all of their crucial military equipment in the sand.
Stripped of their equipment and with their defensive lines completely shattered, France officially surrendered to Hitler just days later in June 1940. And to make things even worse, Italy's dictator Mussolini jumped in and officially joined forces with Germany to create the Pact of Steel. By July 1940, if you looked at a map of Europe, it was entirely unrecognizable. Hitler held near total control over Western and Central Europe.
So, we are left staring at one massive, terrifying question. Hitler firmly had the absolute upper hand. France had fallen, America was strictly maintaining its neutrality and staying out of European affairs, and the Soviet Union still honored their peace agreement with Germany. Britain was left standing completely alone against an unstoppable, drug-fueled war machine. How could they possibly survive, let alone turn the tide? Well, that is a fascinating story we will have to uncover